of silence. All right, well, thank you very much for that. With that, I know some of our colleagues here might want to say a few words. So I will open it up. Bruce, if you'd like to make a few remarks.
I would. Thank you, Peggy. Every once in a while, you encounter a truly special person. Noreen was one of those people for me. She was a friend and a mentor who always had time to help in whatever way was needed. She had that rare gift of speaking plainly and honestly and setting me straight, even if I didn't always want to hear it. As Noreen, as special as I felt to have her help and attention, I know that I was not special. Noreen had time for everyone and was ever quick to offer sound advice, volunteer, or even simply listen. She may be most remembered as a political figure. However, that was just the most visible path she chose to give back to the community she so loved. She quietly committed countless hours to many local charitable organizations, spanning decades and a multiple of nonprofits, in addition to town and state roles. Noreen was tireless in her commitment to serve Madison residents. What is astonishing to me is that when her career as state representative was over, she did not sit back and take a well-deserved rest. She jumped at the chance to serve again as select person in Madison. It can be said that Noreen knew everyone. How could she not, after a lifetime of community service? I prefer to say that everyone knew Noreen. And more importantly, we all knew the same Noreen. She did not change to fit the situation. In an age where honesty and pure intentions are in short supply, Noreen stood as a beacon for our better selves. I will miss Noreen as a colleague and a mentor, but mostly I will miss her as a friend.
Nice, Bruce.
Great words. Yeah. Any other selectmen would like to make comments or remarks?
I would like to, Peggy. I guess mine's a little more in the form of a personal anecdote. When I first took office as a selectman, Noreen met with me and gave me what she said was all of the advice I would ever need to be a good selectman. And she summed it up in 2 words. She said, "Love Madison." I've tried to keep that with me through many a thicket, and I think it's terrific advice for all of us. I remember my very first meeting as a selectman, Noreen honored me. When I walked into the room, she pulled out the chair for me and sat me at the selectmen's table. It was a marvelous gesture. It made me feel very welcome. And you can imagine my delight many years later in 2021, when Noreen returned to the selectmen's table, and it was my honor to pull out the chair for her upon her return. Returning that favor just felt so good to me. I think to sum up, when I think of Noreen, I am reminded that sometimes divinity is just being present for each other.
Nice words. Scott, do you have any remarks you'd like to add?
Well, I mean, I don't have the legacy that both Al and Bruce have with Noreen. I obviously served with both Sharon Kokaruda and Shane in previous committees and sports and all that in town. So I knew their family, and I know her connection to family and the importance of family, and the importance and love of the town of Madison. And I think, that to me really rises to the top in terms of what Noreen brought to the table for our board, and her really unselfish serving of the town of Madison. But to Al's point, she loved the town, she loved her family, and she was doing everything possible to improve the community. Did we always agree on every issue? Absolutely not. And she was a fierce competitor. Noreen was the best at, the counterpoint were, maybe an alternative viewpoint that we need to consider. And I think that made us a better board. Candidly, I think, always looking at things from a variety of viewpoints, challenging norms is truly important. And that's what makes democracy its best. And so I really thank Noreen. I think she was an authentic leader. She was always true to herself, always true to her beliefs. And I think she will be sorely missed in the town of Madison, certainly on this board.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, I guess I would like to also echo that one thing that I think has all caused us to reflect a lot with her passing is her love of Madison. And that's kind of what unites all of us into public service. We do this because we care about our community. It can be sometimes a very thankless job. And so to see somebody who has dedicated over 40 years of her personal time and at times professional time serving this town is an incredible legacy and lesson to all of us. And she was also a deeply personal person. She just had a great personal touch. I'll share one anecdote. When I was new to the Board of Finance, my husband and I adopted a baby. Surprisingly, it came more quickly than we thought. And she was one of the first people to come up to me and congratulate me, and also had a small gift for my daughter. And I'd only met her, in passing before that. So I think she recognized we're all outside of our political lives, people with families and lives that go on. And she knew that and appreciated that and was very sensitive to that. So she does leave a great legacy, and she also has a fantastic family that's is here in town. And so we're just grateful for her service, and she sets an example for all of us. So with that, I guess lots of opportunities to reflect and learn from Noreen, and hopefully carry on some of her legacy in our service to our town. Okay, so with that, I will move on to the meeting today. So I would like to call to order the Board of Selectmen meeting for Tuesday, January 10th, 2023. Please all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Flag. I took down my slide, so. Oops. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. All right, moving on. Actually, let me share again my screen here. Excuse me, let me move that on. Just wanted to give a quick update that can you see my screen?
No.
No. Okay. Hold on a second. I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm having all these issues. All right, how's that?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, great. And then I'll put it up on presentation now. We've changed some settings on Zoom and I have not figured this out, so apologies. In terms of just my quick update, I mean, some good news to share. That right before the end of the year, the town was awarded 2 major federal grants that were approved in the recent omnibus federal spending package. One was for $2.5 million to help fund the expansion of the Madison Hose building downtown and create a dedicated town emergency operations center. And then the second grant is $1 million to assist in installing a backup generator at Polson. Polson was kind of the earmarked last year during a town study where a committee made a recommendation. We move our town shelter, which is currently our town campus gym, to a better setting that offered more amenities and just better things that we could offer the public. But unfortunately, the only building in town that we have a backup generator during storms is this town campus. And so it was determined that Polson would be the best location for a town shelter. So that was another grant that we received. And just very excited. I want to give a shout out and thanks to our congressional delegation, including Joe Courtney, who worked very hard, particularly on the EOC grant. And he sponsored that. And then Senator Blumenthal sponsored the emergency shelter grant. So these are two great projects that have been kind of on the back burner for quite a while in our CIP plan. And looking forward to perhaps pulling them forward now that we've got some of the funding that we need. And I just want to highlight also that the town over this last year has been very successful in applying for and winning these grants. And this is a summary. This is not all inclusive. This doesn't include some of the road projects and things like that. But I just wanted to highlight some of the state and federal grants that we received just in 2022 that was awarded to us, which totaled about $9.2 million. The good thing about this is it allows us to not have to tax taxpayers, our residents, to pay for these projects now. This takes things out of the CIP or a portion of the spending out of the CIP, so it doesn't have to factor into our budget. And so I just think it's a great win for us, and it's enabling us to move forward on a number of fronts with different projects that maybe had been kind of sitting on the shelf for a while because of lack of funding. So I wanted to highlight that, and I will be coming back to the board as we get into the budget discussions, because some of these grants are going to require matching. We'll talk about, those priorities and where those funds could come from. But I just wanted the public to know that we're pushing as hard as we can to get these projects moving forward. And we're excited to most recently with these two recent grants that we received from the federal government. So with that, I will stop sharing for now and turn it over to any liaison reports or selectmen comments.
Given the holidays, I have no updates or reports.
Yeah.
End of report.
Okay.
The Academy Building Committee met last night and entertained proposals from 10 different architectural firms and whittled the list down to the 5 firms that they will interview in person. The interviews will take place on January 24th, and they will be video recorded so that the public can have a look at what a committee has to go through to make their final selection. So they do expect to select an architect on or about January 24th.
Great. It's good to see that moving forward. I know a lot of people have been asking about the progress, and I think we had prioritized the new school project just because of the timing restrictions on that. But Academy is now up and running and moving forward quickly, so which is great to see.
And if I could put in a plug for the advisory committee for Academy, the survey remains open until January 13th. That is a survey asking the public what they would like to see in the Academy Community Center in terms of programming and facilities. So we want to continue to encourage the public to participate in that survey, which can be found online on the town's website. I understand there are well more than 1,000 responses so far.
Good to hear.
Great. Peggy, I think it's worth mentioning the 2 little working groups that we've got going. The first is on the strategic plan and that process. Peggy and I with staff are working to get that project moving forward again, build upon the work that was done a few years ago, and it consistent with what we've done in the past. We're looking out at other communities and trying to pick and choose the best practices that we can find and incorporate them into what's right for Madison. And I expect that shortly we'll be coming back to the board with a request to put out for bid a consulting firm to help us along and facilitate that process. And secondly, and later in the agenda is the short-term rental discussion. And again, we're working on a document that is going to be suitable for public input, public reaction, and public editing, and for lack of a better way to say it. And I'm using the word public over and over again to assure everybody that is following this discussion that the work we're doing now is just in preparation of a public discussion. So we are in no way going to be presenting for any sort of real vote a completed thought that won't take into consideration what people in the community would like to or would not like to see. So I know that we'll probably have a few comments coming up next in the agenda, and just want everybody to keep in mind that this is the natural process unfolding. And we welcome your comments, and you will have other opportunities as well in a more structured hearing format later in the coming weeks.
Right. Okay. With that, I guess just to make mention all of the citizens' comments, but I do want to say that, like I said, this is going to be a process. There's going to be public hearing and the ability to submit comments directly to the board also. So if you would like to make a comment relating to short-term rentals this morning, I request that you keep it brief because we've got a lot to go through today. And also know that you can submit anything in writing and it will go into the public record, and there'll be more opportunities to do this at special meetings and public hearings. And with that, I will open it up to citizens' comments. And please just raise your hand if you'd like to make a comment. And my assistant will move you up.
Not seeing any hands raised yet.
Okay, great. All right, then we will move on to, I'll just call it one more time. I'm just looking to, it looks like a lot of staff is on this morning, but with that, I will move it on to, I'd like to get a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented to the board.
So moved.
Second, great. All right, any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Great, thanks. All right, and then moving on to item number 6, which is discuss regulatory options relating to short-term rentals. So what I will do is I'm going to share my screen again. Hopefully this will, there we go. There we go. Ah. All right. Yeah, this has definitely changed. I have to swap views now. You can see it whole screen, hopefully.
Yes.
Okay. And we've included our town planner, Aaron Mannix. So I think our last meeting several months ago, we discussed having a small team, myself and Bruce and Aaron, kind of tackle this issue a little more directly and focus on some existing examples in the state of Connecticut. And so we kind of got together and talked through a number of different ordinances that had been passed by other towns. And I think as part of that discussion, I think one of the things we struggled with is really what is our primary goal as a board. I think there was a lot of conversation about wanting to do something, wanting to address the issues. But I think the takeaway that I had, and I think Bruce and Aaron and I also had, is just trying to get the board to come into agreement about what the objectives would be for this ordinance. If we're going to put some sort of regulation in place, and the regulation we'll talk about later can be a range of things, we need to all agree on what those goals could be. and why we're doing this. And so I have sent out a draft to the board of what I thought those objectives are based on the different public feedback that we received. People advocating for regulation, people wanting to continue to have a short-term rental property, and trying to find some sort of balance in the community. And so this was kind of a reflection of conversations, but obviously here for conversation. And I think once we can kind of narrow down what those objectives are, and we're happy with them, it makes it easier to look at all the terms of an actual ordinance that we would put into place to see how they impact what our objectives are. So with that, I'll open it up for Selectmen's comments on what is proposed on here. And, you know, I've got it on the screen. I think we all had talked about identifying, monitoring, and tracking. That is something we realized we just don't have that information. And Aaron had presented different ways to do that through, you know, technology and staff. And then it gets into, you know, rather than walking through the bullet points, I don't know if you'd rather just kind of give your views on those you agree with or disagree with.
I mean, just a quick reaction to the slide and the previous discussions. Yeah, I'm definitely in favor of identifying, monitoring, and tracking short-term rental activity in Madison as an opportunity for us to collect some data. I think this will better help us truly identify the scope of the problem. As I reflect on previous conversations with Aaron and maybe that third party that came and presented to us, talking to the police, I'm still not convinced we've identified the problem that we're trying to solve here. And I would hate for us to sort of put the cart before the horse and jump to extreme regulation, you know, and an ordinance that maybe is ultimately too restrictive without really understanding the data and the problem at hand inside the town of Madison. And so I think a great opportunity here is to start looking at, you know, identifying and the short-term rentals, how many are out there, and hopefully that starts to lead us towards a better data set.
No, Scott,
Go ahead, Scott. I'll be very brief, Bruce. Thanks. Peggy, I think your slide does accurately capture the various viewpoints that the public has presented to the selectmen on this issue. And it's easy to see that there are folks with very different perceptions of just how extensive the problem is. So I think this slide is very effective in demonstrating that we've heard all of the testimony.
It is a complex issue, no doubt.
it is. Fortunately, you know, we've got quite a few examples of regulations and ordinances that other towns have implemented, and really in a spectrum of reaction to it. Right, there have been some that have been quite draconian. I mean, really seeking to almost ban it, and then others that are much more balanced and thoughtful, and that's sort of where we've been focusing our attention. There's a couple of towns that have done a really nice job at identifying the high level potential issues and then responding with reasonable regulations around them. And Peggy, you sent this out and I said I didn't have any edits. I don't know how we missed the safety aspect of all of this, but that's certainly been part of our discussion. So I would add that as a bullet.
Okay.
The idea that people are going into a new structure, not oriented to it. We want to make sure that the basic safety necessities are in place. And, again, some towns require that the town go in and do an inspection. Other towns require that the renter or the landlord certifies that they've got it all in place with some documentation. I think our discussions have been more around the certification, right? We're sensitive to the demands on town time. I think our starting point is that the people renting properties, we're going to assume, best intent as a starting assumption. So certifying with some documentation that they've got appropriate safety measures in place, fire extinguishers, an egress map, that type of thing. So Scott, I think, we have an opportunity to put in a more comprehensive regulation than just a register. And we're not going to have to spend a lot of time and energy arriving at a working draft that we can talk about. I know it's difficult in the abstract, but having gone through these documents, I do think there's enough example out there for us to follow that we'll be able to do this pretty easily.
Okay,
I guess my challenge to that point, Bruce, though, is, again, I don't think we've put a fine point on what the problem is. That to me seems to be a theme in every one of our conversations. I recall it multiple times out loud, is what is the problem we're trying to solve? And I would hesitate for us to go down the path of regulating something until we ultimately know what the problem is that we're trying to solve. And so I guess I'm cautious, and I would prefer to sort of walk before we run relative to governance here, as it will put significant demands on our town staff, and frankly, the homeowners themselves. So I think we've got to be thoughtful here on moving too far. And I think, to me, collecting data would be the best way to start the process.
so I think that, Scott, you're pointing to what my next slide is. And before we move away from objectives, I just want to make sure that, because I'd like to me, this is critical that we need to all agree on these bullet points, because that's the lens that we should be looking at in terms of any type of proposed ordinance. And so I would suggest, to address Bruce's issue, is really bullet point number 2 is more about ensuring short-term property owners follow best practices and provide a safe environment, or something to that effect. So we
And
could
certainly that, yeah, I agree, Peggy. I think
Okay.
that's
Okay, and then I think that the one that's really the most difficult one to do without creating limitations is the 4th bullet point: protect neighborhood quality of life by reducing rental turnover. I think one of the themes that I heard a lot when we'd spoken to residents is just this in and out, their lack of neighborhood, lack of community. And so, but really the only way to do that is to limit how often those properties are being turned over, right? So, and so I think that we can create all these other guidelines and things to make sure that the quality of life, making sure that, people aren't coming at 2 o'clock in the morning, waking up their neighbors. Those are types of things that we can try to encourage better behavior by the property owner, but without banning it outright. We're not going to be able to fully satisfy people on that 4th bullet point. I just want to acknowledge that. But I think we're also balancing that with some of the other things that we list later, right? The ability to generate income, the ability to offer what can be a benefit to the community of having accommodation options in town. And so I just wanted to highlight that and make sure people are comfortable with that language. I know we're not voting on this tonight, but I think those are going to be critical points in terms of how we look at any future regulations. So maybe,
and honestly, I don't want to minimize the point. Bruce, I like the point that you made about safety too. I do think, at the end of the day, we need to be ensuring that everybody feels safe in our community. But how we do that and the process that we go about governing that may vary. And there may be varying degrees of how we do that. So, but I don't want to minimize.
Scott. I think you're absolutely right. And I think that there are several different filters that we're going to want to pass this through. And so, Peggy, I'll pick up on this fourth bullet point, right? And by way of example, a homeowner who's got a carriage house or a cottage in their backyard that is, got short-term rentals turning over. I would argue, in all likelihood, that's probably not adversely impacting the neighborhood life, as opposed to a home that's got parking space for one car and consistently has 5 cars parked in the street and around and on the lawn and is changing over every couple of days. So I think that we're going to have to consider the language we choose in light of these different scenarios, and then modify as appropriate.
But herein lies the point that I was making earlier, which is about data. How often is that 5-car situation happening? Is it, predominantly a couple of houses versus the, X number of homes that are in our community? I just think we need to better understand the data such that we can identify what the problem is, versus if we just jump to regulating, particular classes of rentals as an example. I'm not sure we may not be solving the right problem, I guess.
Well, and here is where I think, so I think the goals and objectives, it sounds like we're pretty almost there on that. And I think we'll just finalize those at our next meeting, have people reflect on them again. I'm sure we'll get some more public input after today's meeting.
Yeah.
And then the next thing is, well, how do we do that? Scott, to your point, what's the process? And so there's a spectrum that the town can consider in terms of an ordinance, and on one end is kind of the least restrictive, or least easiest to manage from a town standpoint, I would say, and that is just a registration process. And this is what I know had been talked about a couple of years ago when this first issue came up. And then as you move along that spectrum, you can have more teeth to that. They're all going to require an ordinance, because we're going to make people who are doing short-term rental activity either register and then put obligations on top of that, or just register, so we have to decide how much of those obligations and restrictions we're going to do. And that can go all the way to banning it, or then somewhere in the middle where we're putting in some limitations on either number of people or parking or days, and then some of the safety elements and the inspection elements. The more we go from green to red, obviously the more restrictive it's going to be, and the more regulatory staff is going to be required. And tracking mechanisms and enforcement as we go from green to red, because now we're building up and creating more of an infrastructure to creating rules and regulations around activity. So I think this just kind of highlights that, and there's obviously pros and cons as you move along that spectrum. So I don't know if we need to talk a lot about this, but this is pretty much just highlights what our options are. And then I think in our working group, if I'll go to the next slide, we took a sample town, Simsbury, not because we necessarily agreed with everybody in Simsbury, what they're saying in Simsbury's ordinance, but I think we liked the structure. It was one that had been fully vetted legally, and then also been now in place. And so I think we just like the way it was structured. So, and when we say that, how it was written. Now, there are things that we obviously would need to consider that might be quite different for what our objectives are. I would argue that theirs is fairly restrictive, because it does create more limitations on property owners, but at the same point, at least it gives you that topic so that we as a board can then work through it and figure out what are we trying to do here. So we have kind of a skeleton with headers from their ordinance, and then we can kind of work through and figure out what we think is more appropriate for Madison. And so this is kind of something that I don't know how you want to do this today. So I'll ask board members, do you want to start working through each of these topics and coming up with consensus? Or do you want to have all this being, vetted in a special meeting. We certainly have time today to go through some of this. And then the last slide, which is I think what Bruce was referring to, is the process. And I just want to highlight this particularly for members of the public, that once the board works through that, we're going to come up with a draft document that includes all those, the purpose of why we're doing this, and then the different pieces of the regulation. And then we would take that and we would go to, a lot of town boards are going to be impacted by that. Planning and zoning, just for informational. I think it's always helpful to get that perspective. The Economic Development Commission, Police Commission, because a lot of this might create parking limitations, and they're the local parking authority. And to be honest, the police department is going to be possibly the one that has to deal with the complaints at times. And also planning and zoning, you know, it's going to be the town planners department that might end up being the, you know, regulatory body for this. So we got to get a lot of feedback so people understand what's going to be required from their board and commission or the departments. And then ultimately that would coalesce into a draft ordinance that we would then take to public hearing and get public feedback again from it. Maybe modify the draft based on that, send it to a second public hearing, and then the board would essentially vote on the final ordinance, and then it would be implemented, and we would have to talk about a timeline. I just want to highlight too, it is unlikely that anything we have now would be in place for this summer. I think if we got this done, say March, I don't think you could put a bunch of restrictions where people have rental commitments and things like that for the summer. But, you know, depending on what the regulation is, if it's just registering, that's a possibility. But if now you're restricting, that would be, I think, a burden and unfair to property owners to have something going into place rapidly. But that's something the board would have to discuss. So knowing what our next steps are and kind of the work that needs to be done now, I think as terms of just working through each of these points, I guess I want to get your thoughts about what you'd like to accomplish today versus moving forward.
Perhaps you'll allow me to lead off here. Peggy, if you wouldn't mind putting up the tricolored slide of, thank you. I think at the moment I'm a greenie. I'm up at the top of this progression list. Undoubtedly, based on the public testimony we've heard, there are some bad actors in town, and I don't think I have a good fix on the extent of the bad actors and what might be done to help them improve their behavior. I do know that I'm in favor of a measured response to this issue, a proportional response, a targeted response. If this is a classic, I don't want to build a steamroller to squash an ant here. This, I think we need to be very careful and selective before we get into what looks to me like a very complex set of regulations. There are at least 3 pages that if you put up there, Peggy, which have each of those subsections seem to me to contain their own controversy and complexity. So my sense is for most of the history of our town, summer rentals have not been a problem in most neighborhoods. There may be a trend line indicating that the number of problems is increasing, but at the moment, I don't have a certainty in my mind that we need to move down into the yellow and the red on your slide here. So I'm very interested in what my colleagues have to say, and I'm certainly prepared to change my mind, but I'm sort of hovering up in the green at the moment.
Well, so while I agree, I don't know that I can exactly quantify exactly what's going on. I am taking as my primary data point the initial petition that we received and the ongoing active correspondence that we're receiving as evidence that this is a problem that a significant number of people in the community want us to address. And so I'm not as concerned with data collection I do agree with the points that have been raised that, is this just one or two properties? I don't know if it's one or two properties, but it doesn't, the bad actors don't represent the majority of the properties that are being rented. However, I don't think we can write an ordinance that targets a particular address. And so the properties that are good actors, aren't going to be adversely impacted by a regulation that they're already in compliance with, just because of their good business practices or their good renting practices. So I think, that's where I'm at now. I think we have enough data to move forward with some form of regulation that moves us into these more yellow thoughts. I kind of stop at the, banning all short-term rentals. I don't think that's an authentic Madison solution. And some communities have done that. I don't think that any ordinance is going to magically fix everything, but it provides us with a framework to react to those instances and and the one-offs, and then also react to the chronic problems.
I want to just pick on one word that you just used, Bruce, because I think it's an important one. React. I think we've got to be very careful that we don't also overreact. And at least from what I'm hearing, to the point of maybe some of the previous data, and I absolutely, we need to understand and make sure we're leveraging. And we have talked a lot about that survey and the data that was put out there. I think it was certainly really, really helpful to start getting our arms around it. But at the same time, I've also heard that several of those rentals that were deemed sort of problems have actually moved to long-term rentals. So some of those issues that were swirling around may have actually been resolved. And I think once we have the data and once we start registering, I think that'll help us move down the path of really better understanding and identifying the problem. So I guess I would echo kind of where it sounds like you guys are both at. Bruce, you may be a little farther down in the yellow than I'm comfortable with. I would prefer to start with the green and the green only from a registration standpoint. I'm not all that comfortable with regulating something until we really understand what the problem is.
So I feel like that's kind of where we came out a couple months ago. And then as we get into the weeds of the regulate piece, it became a big discussion, Bruce and Aaron and I. And I think we kind of like evolved a little bit more beyond just register. But I'm just wondering if, we start with a registration ordinance and we could tag on a few other things to that we feel the safety issue. I think we all agree that there has to be some sort of guidance for people about what should be allowed, in terms of people checking in and noise and parties and events maybe there's a way to do that through the registration process with specific guidelines for properties that we could issue without necessarily requiring enforcement at this point. Now, we may want to enforce in the ordinance, but I feel like if we start with something that allows us to get into talking, because a lot of this really does mean we have to get into each one of these topics, right?
But even to that point, Peggy, of the noise, I think we certainly heard about, yeah. But are we making the leap to the safety issue too? Have there been documented cases where safety, vis-a-vis maybe a police complaint or something, right, would lead us down the path of our residents feeling unsafe? I guess I just don't want to overreact to that point and start regulating something if in fact there's been no demonstration of folks feeling unsafe.
Well, I guess when I talk about safety, I'm talking about safety of the property. not that the residents aren't feeling safe. I think that is something that is a very different issue, right?
Right.
I think
An
though,
important thought, Scott, but not exactly the way we've been using safety
Right.
in this discussion. We're talking about the safety of the people in the structure.
so really kind of the third bullet point under regulate provides a mechanism to determine
Fire codes,
property
things
health,
like that
safety.
you're talking about. Yeah.
And so we've talked about, being able to put in some sort of self-certification, like if we have a list of a checklist that people have to do. Do you have smoke detectors? Because the other concern I have is, are you going to be requiring certain egresses, and then it gets into inspections and everything else. So I think those things can be part of a draft, and we just have to figure out the level of requirements that we would be willing to put into this, knowing that would require enforcement by the town.
I sense we may be closer to agreement than we realized. If I understand Bruce correctly, he's somewhere in the yellow down here, but it seems to me in order to get to the yellow or the red, we still have to go through the green. I'm sorry, I'm oversimplifying this, but I don't want to get lost in the details here. So I would be quite willing to, as a selectman, to say, our intention is to perhaps get to the yellow, but we got to go through the green to get there. And so I guess I'm ready to start on the green right now, and with the intention of the data produced by the green will help us get to writing a good regulation in the yellow. Do others see this the same way, that we have to sort of go through this progression anyway, even though we don't know where the end point is? Maybe at some point we'll decide we need to be in the red, but at the moment, I don't think we can just jump to the red.
I agree with some of what you just said, Al. Sorta, I guess it would be my answer. So I think we need to start with the green, as you said, to collect and gather data. And then that would be sort of a stage gate to deciding whether or not we need to regulate or not. I'm not predetermining that we need to regulate something until we understand what the problem is.
I mean, so there is a way that we could come out very quickly with the registration process and then have a time limit in that ordinance that the board is required, say, in a year or two to, then either re-up the ordinance, so to speak, or expand it, in some way. So there's a mandate to do that versus, sometimes it's easier to just put it aside and say, okay, we check that box, but we really need to be monitoring and ensuring that we're learning from the registration information that we have to get ahead of any problems. But so I think then, we come back with a registration type draft that we send to the board. Does that sound great? And then we have a few areas. I know Bruce's kind of hot button issues are focused on safety. And then I think we need to look at, there's some other things in here. It's not simple, is the definition. And maybe we can all agree on that. Is it 30 days, less than 30 days? That means anybody who rents their property out for less than 30 days would be required to register. Now, some places might not, they might say 3 weeks or 2 weeks. That's what we care more about. Those are the high frequency turnovers. But, the definition I think the state looks at is less than 30 days in terms of taxing purposes. So is that something we could all agree on? At least less than 30 days is the definition of what we would require people to register for.
And just to build on, Peggy, on your comments, this is really a kind of a term of art in the document. So tenants who are in a rental for more than 29 days or 30 days are considered long-term, and they're impacted by a different set of regulations. and the landlords are impacted by a different set of regulations. So it's a threshold of moving from a short-term rental structure to a long-term rental structure. And so I think the 29 days makes sense. What we've seen other towns put in, the non-consecutive nature of that. So you can't rent to the same person for 15 days, 7 times straight, right? If you rent to somebody, you can't consecutively rent to them for more than 29 days.
I think the caveat to that may be owner occupied. There may not be, and I'm not sure, we need to get Aaron or somebody to chime in on this, but I think owner occupied may not have as much of the restrictions or regulations on them.
I mean, somebody who's renting out a room in their house to somebody for more than a month?
Yeah, or a little house on their property type of thing, but they're still living on the property.
So if somebody had a cottage on their house and they were renting it out for 6 months, it would be a long-term rental, and that tenant would have different due process than somebody who's doing it for a weekend or 15 days or 29 days, I believe. Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong. You're on mute.
Can't
No,
hear
you're not.
you.
There you go.
Still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
I had my speakers all switched from our meeting last night, sorry. I would say, yes, you can, that's part of the discussion as far as distinguishing owner occupied versus non, or absentee owner rentals. But the term of the rental, I think, should be the same, whether it is owner occupied or not. So the definition of a short-term rental should be either less than 29 days, less than 30 days. And perhaps, legal counsel can kind of give a recommendation on which day it should be, if it's 29 or 30, I think. But generally speaking, it's less than a month would be considered short-term rental.
Okay, so, and this gets into kind of the details now of some of these. I think that, though, there's some things we could maybe put a stake in the ground on. So it sounds like that's where we would be. And then, I think this is where like limits on rentals. So the Simsbury ordinance is quite restrictive. You can only do 100 days per year. Would we want to consider at this stage the limit on rental days? Or is this just more, let's collect the data right now and see, part of the data could be how often is the house rented out, how many days a year or something. We want to collect that kind of data right now before we would actually put a limitation on it.
Yeah, I think we're in collection mode, not restricting.
So I'm really struggling with the idea of just collecting data. And so I guess I would want to see what more that structure is. Registering a rental property is creating a mailing list. If we're collecting data, are we going to include a reporting requirement that the property owner gives us in detail the occupancy that they've had, the length of stay, the number of cars that have been in their yard, the number of complaints that they've received? Is that all part of the data collection, Scott, that you're talking about? Or are you simply saying, let's just make them register and then we'll see what happens?
You're muted, Scott.
I'm much more of the register at this point, Bruce, and I'm not sure see what happens is fair, but I think, then, the data, the conversation, the input from police, input from our town planning mechanism would then help make us look at the data in a more informed way to drive decision making.
Okay, so yeah, so wait and see. Yeah, that's a little bit of a loaded phrase, but I guess my point is that I'm not sure that we have in place the data collection for the type of information you think we're going to get. And I want to make sure that if we do this, that we're specific about that.
Well, I think that, well, right. And that's, I think, a good point, Bruce, because I think that we can get through registration process. How many of the short-term rentals in town are purely short-term rentals versus a person who rents their house out because they go away for, 6 months every year to Europe or something, and then they use their house as a short-term rental when they're not here, or they live in Florida and they use it as short-term rental when they're not here. That's the type of data we could get through a registration process. Is this your primary residence? And what times of year or when, how often do you rent it? And they could say 365 days a year, or they usually have it rented for 60 days. Like, it could be a survey. So that would be helpful information, because, I think one of the concerns, we go back to our objectives in the beginning, is that we may have corporate owners or people who are not part of the community buying properties to rent out, right? And that's what I think a lot of people fear. They're seeing that happen in other parts of the country and possibly even in Connecticut. So I think that we could get that kind of data in the registration process to start, and then you get a better handle on, is that like one property, or is that most of the short-term rentals in town? And this is just, we're brainstorming here, right? Because we're trying to solve these problems without doing it with a heavy hand. So I guess the summary is that there is a way to get that through the registration process, that type of information. Otherwise, I don't know how you come up with the number of days per year number. Like, how do you decide what's the right number then to limit it?
Well, and I think we still have to have that conversation. Do we want to limit it at all?
Right.
And when we were talking amongst us in the smaller group, we all immediately thought that, boy, that feels a little too restrictive for Madison. So I don't think any of us would sit here and defend 100 days as the right number. Any of us, Peggy, me, or Aaron. We understood what they were trying to do. They're trying to make it economically unfeasible for a commercial owner to have a property in Madison and be limited in the income that they can get on it. So that's the purpose of that. And I think we didn't think that was a lever we wanted to pull here in Madison. Obviously up for discussion. I think where I'm at, I've always advocated for a more comprehensive document, one that moved past just the registration and data collection goal. I think, if we arrive at that, I will have a difficult time supporting it, but I'll also sort of hold that judgment and see where we progress in the conversation. But, just as a heads up, I think, we've got enough examples out there from other communities and what they're doing. And we've got a considerable amount of input from residents. So I still believe that a more comprehensive document is achievable and is appropriate.
Bruce, let me see if I can build a bridge between let's say the greenies and the yellowies in this conversation. To me, an ideal data collection system would provide the community and the selectmen with information regarding where are the problems and how extensive are they. So to me, that's needed. If we're going to do some kind of data collection, that for me is the end goal. Is does it identify the qualitative and quantitative problems that this community is experiencing? The bridge I'd like to build is, it seems to me you have in your mind, Bruce, there's certain things that you're prepared to regulate immediately. And I don't know that the two are impossible to do together. For example, you just mentioned the corporate ownership. Whether we have the legal authority to somehow restrict that, I'm very interested in learning about. But if you feel that's something immediately that we can and should do, I'm certainly prepared to entertain that. Because that to me is targeted, Bruce. It's not amorphous and wouldn't inadvertently apply to all kinds of situations that we wouldn't want it to. So in your mind, Bruce, are there certain things that you would sort of immediately be prepared to put the hammer down on?
Well, I think that my preference would be for us being the working group, to continue on the path of using the structure of the Simsbury ordinance, put in what we think is appropriate for discussion and workable in Madison, and then let the board discuss the puts and takes on that document. So at the highest level, we're at this crossroads of, do we simply register the properties, or do we register and then take the next step of put some regulation and structure in place around them? And if the mood of the board is to do the registration, then the other work, as Peggy said, we can do that really quickly, right?
Bruce, can you just
spend a lot of time doing the other stuff? My preference would be to complete that work on the other stuff and bring it back to the board as a more complete thought.
I think that the problem is there's when we say register, I mean, we can call it permit, right? A permit now has some teeth to it, right? Only these types of things can get a permit, right? And so that kind of moves us a little bit more into the yellow, but that could be the approach that we would take. So when we talk about register, it's just data dump, as you said, right? Collecting information. Permitting
I'm using the terms interchangeably, but yes.
Yeah. Okay. Because it does difference though, because if we register, anybody can register. If we permit, it's like, these are the qualifications in order for you to get a permit to do short-term rental activity, right? And then these are the criteria that would allow your property to qualify as a short-term rental. So it does get into a lot more details, and even owner is very hard, because Al, to your point, corporate owners, right? What is a corporate owner? A lot of properties south of Route 1 are owned by trusts or LLCs. So they're not owned by individuals. So now you're getting into us having to understand the ownership of the property better. What is the intent behind the ownership, right? So you can have people living in a home year round that's owned by LLC. So I'm just pointing these things out where we land on this, and I'm sure our legal counsel can provide a lot of advice. But if one of our objectives, as we said before, was to try to discourage that. So we don't want to be seen as a town where somebody comes up and buys 10 properties and just churns them all the time for rental income, right? That is not creating a good neighborhood. That's not part of the community that we feel that we have. So we want to disincentivize that behavior, but I don't know how best to do that yet. I don't think we have the right answer for that. And that's where we would have to get legal advice. So I guess I'm highlighting again, these are complicated how we would address this because of the considerations in Madison. We're different than Simsbury. But I think here, once again, until we get into each of these things and start looking at the specifics, we're going to kind of keep spinning our wheels. So I think we have to come back with literally that draft registration ordinance that may include some, might be more a permitting or ordinance that has a little bit more threshold to it. And it's all going to be how we define it. So anyway, I'm just, I know we've had several meetings on this, so, but I think it's time that we have to get pen to paper, and really come up with a proposal that the board can rally around. So I think we should set, go
Yeah, I
ahead.
know it's been a challenge to at least start to document something. So I don't mind leveraging the Simsbury draft if that's the right one. I guess I'm not, and probably the public, Bruce, I was going to ask you even just to frame it for the public, because I'm sure the public is not as familiar with what the Simsbury draft talks to, but I think we need to do what's right for Madison. And I think, through the oodles of conversation we've had on this, it feels like we're sort of in the green box at this point. We're in the data collection box. We're in the registration box, whatever you want to call it. And I think we need to walk before we run here, and not overregulate, overreact, drive to a solution where a problem may or may not exist. So, all the commentary resonates with me from the public. I'm really doing my darndest to try to process and listen to all of it. But at the end of the day, I guess I really feel like, starting with data collection and registration is the right way to go. And that is not overreacting to a problem that may or may not exist.
Right. Well, so building on Peggy's previous comments about the Simsbury document, we looked at it really as a structure that felt right. So we've looked at ordinances from Austin, Texas to Portland, Maine, right? As a working document, some of these city ordinances are just too much, right? They're just too complicated.
Exactly.
And then in some of the smaller towns, they're not complicated enough. And we thought the Simsbury as a framework was good. We didn't like where Simsbury landed on every topic, but we liked the topics they identified. And so that's why we're stuck or we're leveraging that particular document. Some things we think they got right. Some things we don't think work in Madison at all. And clearly, from the two things that Peggy's highlighted, Simsbury has landed on this anti-corporate stance and making a requisite that this is your primary residence as to be eligible for this is a pretty clear signal of who they do and don't want renting. And that's probably not where we would go and suggest to the public. I mean, when the three of us were together, we all scratched our head and said, that doesn't feel right. That saying it has to be your primary residence. So that's why Simsbury. It felt a little Goldilocks to us from a structure.
Yeah, and I think it was really the headings and the way it was structured versus the criteria, and the fact that it was Connecticut and seemed vetted in terms of the terminology and things that were being used. So I think that, and obviously we need to have, Aaron will be intricately involved in the drafting of this registration ordinance with town council. And then I think the board really has to be the one that determines what's in it, the term, some of the key hot buttons. There's some legal definitions and things like that. And zoning implications and enforcement implications that we need to get input from town staff. But ultimately, there's no right answer here. It's going to be like,
No.
what feels good, what feels right is the first step in what could be a long process. This is going to be 5-10 years from now, we might end up with a red possibly if we start really discovering we have a big problem here. And then we'll have the data to back it up. And I think people feel better having data to actually develop, restrictions and criteria and limitations for people. So, all right, with that,
Well, just to build on that point though, Peggy, I think it's an important one. You know, there's an artful balance here that we need to strike between, you know, governing something and the time that it will put on our internal town employees, right? With solving a problem and addressing the public challenges and issues and safety and all that kind of stuff. We have to go in with our eyes open here, I guess is my point. That you know, if we are going to go down the path of any regulation or governance, that is going to put real time, real energy, real, you know, blood, sweat, and tears of Erin's team on the ground, and maybe potentially divert her from doing other things that we need her to do that are maybe more strategic or whatever. So I guess I'm not suggesting it's the wrong answer, but I'm suggesting that we need to really be thoughtful about this because it impacts focus.
And budget. So I will
budget.
ask
Yeah,
anything
it's
we do
real.
implement,
Yeah.
you know, we will have to accommodate that in the budget, whether it's purchasing some specialty software, additional staffing hours, you know, anything that we do here, you know, because although we don't know what the, you know, process will be or how many people will be registering. Okay, well, I think then I guess the goal would be to, and I do think this should be a special meeting, the next one where we actually have a document that we go through. And so we'll look to set up that special meeting. We'll have a draft document to go through and we'll try to do that like in 2 weeks. I think that now that we have, I think, a lot of thought and discussion, I know that Bruce has had with Erin and I've had about those qualifications. And then I think really the next phase of this is where I would need to step out. I think once a draft is before the board, because as you know, I've recused myself from voting on this, but I think we're getting into a lot of details that will have a direct impact on me personally and my husband personally. So I feel like it's the appropriate time to step out. I was trying to get a framework of discussion and get information gathered, but I think the next conversation, I would recuse myself going forward on that. So I just want to lay that out and I'll work with Erin and Bruce on this next draft. And then I think it's to the board to then move forward, you know, with where it wants to go in the specifics of this. So
Right.
just to give a heads
And
up.
I'll just say, you know, to Scott and Al, if you felt that we would benefit from Peggy's voice in the discussion, I have every faith that you know, that she would be able to participate and not unduly influence the conversation. So I respect, Peggy, your offer to step, you know, to recuse yourself from it. I'll just put it to the other selectmen that if you felt that it would be a richer discussion with her involved, I would absolutely support that.
Okay, well, we can address that when we get to that point.
It's always a richer discussion with Peggy at the table, right?
I don't know. I think it maybe is time for you to step out.
There's one thread I didn't want to lose that came up at a previous meeting, and that was how can the police department's data gathering systems help us in what we are trying to accomplish going forward? Is there can we work with the police to produce the kind of data that would help illuminate what all of us are trying to accomplish here?
I think that's a great discussion. Really, it's how dispatch tracks these things, right? Complaints and calls. And it's a worthwhile conversation just generally, no matter what happens with this, how nuisance types issues are recorded and tracked. So I think it's a great conversation that I can have with the chief and, you know, figure that out. And then obviously if we have an ordinance in place that has real specifics, that has to be built into the system of complaints, because now there's a law in place, right? But that needs to be part of, you know, the conversation too. But I think we should just be doing that anyway. I'm going to talk to him more about that. Because I think our takeaway was that they didn't really have a way to categorize some of this stuff. It was kind of it was very difficult for them in terms of their existing way they code things and everything in their responses. So.
I also sense there was a bit of reluctance of neighbors to call the police on neighbors too. So I think that's a reality here.
And I think that, creating that complaint system would be different for this, perhaps. That would be part of, I think, what would have to be part of the ordinance is how the town would be. Well, maybe it wouldn't be a part of the ordinance, just that we have to have a mechanism for tracking complaints, and then we would come up with something that would be, beneficial to both the property owner and then also the neighbor. So they feel like they have a real way to do it without, it's tough. It's a tough call because you're neighbors, right? And I think everybody struggled with that even with their own homes. At times you don't like some of their activity, but they're still a neighbor and you're still friends. And so you're trying to find that balance.
On the other hand, Peggy, sometimes homeowners are reluctant to call the police because they think the police aren't interested or aren't going to be responsive. And I think we can help educate the public that indeed can be a police matter and that the public shouldn't be hesitant to contact the police.
Agreed. Okay, well, with that, then I guess we will move on with a firm goal of within the next 2, possibly 3 weeks, depending on scheduling, having a draft type of ordinance to put in front of the board for discussion. Okay, so if everybody's good, we'll move on to item number 7 on the agenda, which is discuss and take action to refer to the Planning and Zoning Commission under Connecticut General Statute Section 8-24, the transfer of land, including 2.35 acres from Mungertown Road, map 56, lot 1, and 6.5 acres from Green Hill Road, map 64, lot 48, from the town of Madison to the Madison Land Conservation Trust for open space purposes.
So moved.
Second is Scott. Okay, great. We have Aaron here, but this is just following on the next step in the process of the topic that we talked about extensively and Aaron presented last time about creating this conservation corridor along the Neck River. And I think this is a great win-win for the town as well as for the Madison Land Trust. Any additional questions for Aaron on this? Okay, and then we'll come back, I think, to probably our next meeting with what our board actions need to be. But this is kind of the first step in that, and that's to go through planning and zoning.
I'd like the record to show I'm recusing myself from this discussion because I'm a member of the Land Trust Board.
Okay. All right. I guess with that, then, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Oh, here's my hand. That's my camera. And then Al is abstaining from this vote. Great. Motion passes. Okay, item number 8, discuss and take action to approve the restructuring of the land use department to include a land use technician into the town's classified plans, salary grade 6, 35.5 hours per week. The position is funded in the current fiscal year budget. Recruitment for the position will commence upon approval by the Board of Selectmen.
So moved.
Second.
Great. This is part of the land use restructuring that Aaron talked about in December, and due to some retirements. And I think we want to get this position moving because this is kind of a key linchpin. And then the other positions at our next board meeting, you'll have job descriptions for that as well as budgetary impact. But like we said, we'll be staying, all of this will be within budget. So any further questions? No. All right. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Okay, motion passes. Great, Aaron, you can get that job launched. Okay, item number 9 is discuss and take action to adopt a resolution abolishing the Job Evaluation Committee, the Landscape Committee, and the Building Code of Appeals.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, great. This is just the board has received a formal resolution in their package, and I know abolish is not necessarily the best language. That was something the attorneys provided, but it's just discontinuing some committees. 2 of them were actually committees that had members seated for many years, and then Job Evaluation Committee is one that the town has had since the 1970s. It was a very, very important role in managing the town and personnel issues and things like that. But over the last, 10 to 15 years, we have a very professional HR department now that kind of fulfills that role. And this is a conversation I know we've had many times in the past about the necessity for the committee, because it does add extra approval layers into the hiring process. And then with the new town charter, we have to either ordinance and make permanent boards and commissions, or we disband them or discontinue them. So these were ones that we're starting that process to do. So any other
So we're
questions?
discontinuing, not abolishing.
Right, and we have had some fantastic volunteers on that committee. So this is not
absolutely.
to be disrespectful to their service. I think the chair has been there for many, many years, and it's been a valuable resource. And I think we're just, dealing with a different kind of organization now that can support the HR functions better. But any other discussion or questions? No? Okay, all in favor of approving the resolution, say aye. Aye. Great, motion passes. There'll be some other boards and commissions that we're going to be looking at restructuring. That process is starting this year, merging a couple perhaps, and then others we will just reordinance. But we have 2 years to do it. So if there's any members of the public, this will be ongoing for the next 12 months to 18 months as the board kind of addresses each board and commission in town. So all right, moving on to the next item on the agenda, which is discuss the reorganization of the administrative risk and grants manager position to a procurement administrator. So I sent a memo to the board about this. I just want to bring it to your attention, and then I'll be coming back at our next meeting with a job description for the procurement administrator. But with the departure of Lauren Rhines, who was a person of many talents and wore many hats, her job was kind of a conglomerate, what's the word I'm looking for? But anyways, different types of roles and responsibilities built under one hat. As she evolved in her career, things were added onto her plate. We kind of created a new next job, which included grant writing, which as we can see, is an important part of our town right now, and has been paying us in spades. So we're looking at her position again. We've redirected some of those functions to other departments. But then I think one thing that I've been talking about since I started in this position was having somebody who focused on procurement, and particularly in light of all the projects going on, large scale projects. I really feel that we need somebody dedicated to focusing on procurement, and that is going to end up saving us money, and it's going to streamline a lot of things. And I also think help town staff tremendously to have a person focus on procurement. So this new position would be procurement plus grants. And it would also result in some cost savings to the town, given the salaries and everything would be actually lower than what the position that we would be replacing are. And that memo details that. So any questions for that? And then as I would be coming back with a detailed job description and stuff for the new position so that we could actually go out and fill it. No? Okay, great. All right. So, and happy offline too. You just want to call or email me before the next meeting. Okay, item number 11, discuss and take action to approve calling the annual town meeting in town campus, Hammonasset Room, and on Zoom on Wednesday, February 1st, 2023 at 6 p.m. for the following purposes: review state of the town report, review 5-year capital plan, to receive the annual report of the permanent boards, commissions, agencies, committees, and the town's audit report in accordance with Article 2, Section 2.1.4.1 of the town charter.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, great.
Either
We're
one.
just, I know we had actually set this for January, but then realized it was conflicted with a workshop, a budget workshop. So we're just pushing it out. And with the new charter, we can do this whenever it makes sense to do it. So we just found a date in February that worked. With that, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, great. So we've set the new town meeting. We can advertise that now. Okay, moving on to item number 12, which is citizens' comments. So please raise your hand if you'd like to make a public comment. And Jacqueline, Do we have any hands raised? I'm looking.
Yep, I'm going to unmute Linda Marino.
I show Linda still muted.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Linda, you're still muted. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I have a couple of comments on the short-term rental issue. I find it a bit disheartening that our select people are saying that a problem may or may not exist regarding short-term rentals, given the record on this issue. I think a lot of residents have expressed their concerns in writing, and I think a problem clearly exists, and I feel like we're not being heard on this issue. Moreover, with respect to data collection, we had problems with the house across the street where fireworks were going up over the top of the roof over the summer. We called the police and they said, we don't get involved in that, right to the Board of Selectmen. So we've actually felt there was actually no place for our concerns to be heard. And we feel that that's continuing, frankly. And then on the legal issue, while we do appreciate all the efforts the board is making to come up with a proposed ordinance, it feels, we have expressed multiple times our view that short-term rentals are not permitted in the first place. And we wrote our letter on January 4th, and we'd like to know where we stand on that legal issue. I think in the article that appeared in the New Haven Register, Peggy Lyons, First Selectwoman Peggy Lyons, was quoted as saying that that issue will be addressed by the town attorney, and we'd like to know whether in fact it will be, because we don't see how the regulations could be read to allow short-term rentals. As Peggy said today, we want a benefit of short-term rentals is accommodation options, and then I saw on the the PowerPoint slides, overnight accommodations. The regulations are clear when such transient accommodations are permitted. It's hotels, motels, and bed and breakfasts. Accessory apartments could easily comply with the bed and breakfast requirements because they're owner occupied for the most part. So we would like to know where we stand on that legal issue.
I will just comment that I have to circle back with town council on that. You will get a response. I just haven't had the opportunity to do that. And there's town council and then there's land use council, and land use council is the attorney that had kind of provided some viewpoints on that. And then we have town council, which would be assisting us on this ordinance. So part of this is making sure that that conversation happens between those two groups as well.
Okay, and could we make sure that that happens before we go ahead and present to the public a proposed ordinance?
I can try to do that. It's just, it's not a simple discussion, obviously, but yes, I can try to do that.
But then it makes sense to me that we should be doing that before a proposed ordinance is presented to the public, since it is an outstanding legal issue on the matter.
Well, as I said, we'll work it through. Okay. So,
Okay.
and we will work it. The ordinance is not, it's going to take months for an ordinance to get finalized. So if there's any additional information the board learns where the ordinance wouldn't be appropriate, we would obviously do that. So any other public comment? I think we've got other hands raised, and thank you.
Yep, I'm going to unmute Kim.
Then you need to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry. I wanted to thank the board for your hard work on this. I'd like to quote to Alan, to Scott, it's not appropriate to use a steamroller approach to squat an ant. In prior testimony that our own town planner gave, that there were approximately 98 homes or units out of 8,200 that are rented on a short-term basis, of which I've heard 1 or 2 out of 8,200 homes that are potentially an issue. And the town planner's report came to the following conclusion. Do we have a problem with short-term rentals? The numbers provided by Granicus don't seem to justify the need to regulate. As an attorney, I'd like to point out that regulation prematurely without sound basis in fact and reasonableness will subject the town to lawsuits. If the board were to decide to implement any type of short-term restrictions on short-term rentals, I believe it's important to note that even the petitioners would exempt owner occupied from proposed town regulation if the owner resides in the home and is renting out, for example, a carriage house. I would add to that the flip side. If I'm living in my carriage house and I want to rent out my home, I provide all necessary protections, and this town, frankly, should not be concerned with this. I also believe that there is responsible property owners in town that own one home in town and rent out a second home. I would argue that they also have great interest in being good neighbors. Therefore, the town should not propose any regulation on those scenarios. I'd also like to point out, in contradiction to what Selectman Wilson had to say, that a 1 month long stay does not necessarily in any way protect residents. In fact, it could make a particular situation worse. Instead of 3 days with a bad renter, you could have 30 days with a bad renter. What matters is the screening process and the ability to kick out a renter. I would like to add that when I was on the Airbnb platform, which I'm not now on, they have many limitations and restrictions. They give you a evaluation of a guest. And if there's conduct in violation of laws, hence my argument for a noise ordinance, that gives the Airbnb platform the means to kick out a bad renter. What I'm very much concerned about is that the 1 or 2 homes that have neighbors that have a problem don't have a means to report it. So when they've tried to call the hotline number, for example, with the police department, there's told that there's really no remedy. So I think to help those residents, of which it sounds like it's 1 or 2 properties, they should be able to have a way to report this, and they should have a police response. It should be documented. And then we should, as Selectman Murphy points out, we should have a means to take a process where we evaluate all this information over time. But as a lawyer, again, I'd like to point out that if we overregulate at this point, if we even go to green on the owner occupied area, I think we're subjecting the town to potential litigation. I think we should focus on data gathering at this point. And, if I'm wrong and it's more than 2 homes, so be it. But if it's only 2 homes and we try to regulate, it's a problem. Thank you.
Okay, Kim, thank you. I know I'm trying to keep comments down, obviously,
Sure.
To a limit of 2 minutes, please. So, but thank you for your comment. And we have a few other hands raised.
Laura, I'm gonna unmute.
There we go. I'd like to thank the board members that did take the time to understand the problem and to read the letters that were sent. And I think the letters that were sent could be looked at to see which letters reflect an unbiased citizen just working for the benefit of the community, and which ones reflect self-dealing. And I think if you look at the letters and you look at the requests for some restrictions on short-term rentals, you'll see that many of the people don't have skin in the game. And if you look at the letters suggesting that you don't regulate, you'll see that those people have a financial interest. And that might be something to look at. And when you're considering an ordinance following many, many other towns and cities all over the world that are starting to look at this issue over the last 10 years since Airbnb, became popular, we might choose a town with lot sizes near the coast more similar to what we're dealing with, which would be Stonington, and not Simsbury, where they have very large lots, and their issues are, people renting out these multi-acre lots and doing glamping. But anyway, thank you for those. Thanks to those of you that did take the time to research the issue. It's certainly an important issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next is Jane.
Okay, thank you. State your name and address, please. I forgot to remind people for that for the record, so.
My name is Jane Gamber and our address is 63 Middle Beach Road. I would like to join everybody else in thanking you for your thoughtful consideration of this short-term rental issue. And I'm not an attorney as the others are, so I really just speak as a neighbor of one of the very large homes right on Middle Beach Road that enjoys very robust rentals from April through October. And to me, anecdotally, it seems that the majority of the issues are really with the larger properties that are being rented and accommodating very large groups. In that light, I'd like to encourage you to really consider maybe a maximum number of people per residential property of, say, 12. That would be 3 families of 4 people, or a group of smaller than the 16 to 20 people who are renting next door to us. And there are 2 homes that are rented. So we have up to 40 people in each driveway. There are 13 to 15 vehicles. It is a problem from the standpoint of size of people as well as the turnover. And with that thought in mind, the safety concerns that you all have expressed are definitely ones that should be considered, not just for the renters, but also for the neighboring properties. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment? I don't see other hands raised. So I'll call once again, any additional public comment? Okay, with that, I will close public comment and then like a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All right. All in favor, say aye. Thank you, everybody, for a great
Aye.
conversation and